Rachel wrung the wet cloth out between her hands into the basin of water at her side, before carefully wiping away the dried blood from the gash on Marcus's arm. The young king of Ghent leaned back tensely against the cold stone wall of the cavern as Rachel cleaned away the dried blood, and the gypsy girl Justine knelt beside her, readying another cloth. Marcus shook slightly, and his skin was deathly pale. His body was still fighting the effect of the poison. Even if Marcus were able to recover, the two young men were far from safety, for they were still deep in the caverns of Rekos, and their fears only grew as they listened to Rachel's story and her intention to marry Dovain in return for his help in restoring Kennedac. Adakis urged her not to trust Dovain, and even in his suffering, Marcus managed to state his objections to her plan. But as they heard the story she told of the fallen king, the destruction of the gypsy people and of the exiles, and the cruelty of the guardian, they fell silent. But Marcus refused to believe the things that Dovain had told her of his ancestor. He was the descendant of the guardian, and would not believe that Altama would have attacked and killed innocent people for no reason. But hearing Rachel speak in a mournful tone, wishing no more than to save her people from destruction, he held his tongue as she tended to his wound. Adakis was confused and did not know what to believe. If what Rachel was telling them turned out to be true, it would change everything. But regardless if they believed Dovain's story, Marcus was still furious that the Dark Lord had taken his battle axe from him. It was his birthright to carry the axe, and his duty to protect it. So even though he was wounded and the poison could surely kill him if he moved, Marcus was determined to reclaim the weapon. He kept insisting that he would be all right, but the two young women would not allow him to stand. Rachel was conflicted about Dovain having the battle axe. She did not blame him for wanting to take it away and hide it, for it had been used to slaughter countless numbers of his followers. But she also felt guilty that it had been taken away from Marcus. Despite her guilt, she would not try to reclaim it from Dovain. She needed to prove that she supported his decisions, for he would soon be her husband and her king. But Justine, who had been sitting quietly listening to their conversation, proposed an idea. Justine suggested that she could sneak into the master's chamber during the night and steal the battle axe while he slept. At this, Rachel was greatly baffled. Justine seemed so afraid of Dovain at times, and yet she had encouraged her without hesitation to accept the Dark Lord's proposal of marriage, and now Justine was offering to betray Dovain, risking his wrath upon her. The Favian girl was confusing to Rachel, but she made no attempt to change Justine's mind. Rachel simply stood up when she had finished cleaning Marcus's wound and excused herself to her chambers, wanting no part of what they were planning. And it was not very long before Justine was also excusing herself, creeping quietly toward the inner sanctum of the caverns. Her dress skimmed lightly over the stone cavern floor, her hand grazing the wall as she navigated through the tunnels in the darkness. Her long golden hair splayed over her shoulder, flickering as she turned her head back quickly to glance over her shoulder, making sure she was not being followed. But the caverns were empty and quiet that evening, and when she finally reached the inner sanctum, she made her way swiftly through the doors of the fortress in the heart of Rekos. The winding halls drew deeper into the darkness, and she found herself moving blindly toward the end of the north wing, where the door to Dovain's bedchamber stood in ominous solitude. She breathed in deeply as she reached the doors, and her hands found the door handle. The heavy door swept open as she pulled back the handle, and she drifted into the dim chamber silently. A chill crept up her back as the door softly closed behind her. A single candle on a nearby desk cast a faint glow across the enormous room. The ceiling was high, and the walls stretched out seemingly endlessly in all directions, the enormity emphasized by the shadows which enveloped most of the room. And there, against the far wall in the faint glow of the candlelight, was a massive bed. His bed. Red silken sheets draped across the lavish frame, and golden columns rose from each corner in twisting spires. The dim light flickered across the shimmering sheets and gleamed brilliantly off of the gold columns. And there, resting back easily against the cushions of the bed, the Dark Lord watched intently as Justine entered. His arms were crossed behind his head, and his eyes had a grogginess to them, but they followed her sharply as she crossed the room. Justine moved closer until she stood beside his bed, and his hollow black eyes gazed up at her curiously. He smirked slightly as she drew near to his bedside, and he waited patiently for her to speak. Folding her hands nervously, she said, "I have come to warn you, master. The visitors in your caverns have sent me to steal back the battle axe which you claimed from the guardian's descendant. They wanted me to take it while you slept. They were conspiring against you. The two young men, and Rachel." Justine lied, and Dovain raised an eyebrow at the mention of Princess Rachel. "Oh?" Justine nodded deeply. "Yes, my lord. That is why I have come to warn you. She is plotting with her two companions. She has sent me to retrieve the battle axe so that her companions may return to kill you in your sleep." Dovain chuckled deeply and said, "Then you have served me well. Thank you." But his low tone robbed his words of any reassurance he may have intended. However, Justine felt a small sense of pride as Dovain praised her. Unfolding his arms from behind his head, Dovain sat himself upright and patted his hand on the bed beside him, saying, "Sit down for a moment, my dear." She did as he commanded. She had been fascinated by Dovain. He was so unlike Salvador, who was spontaneous, cruel, and abusive. Dovain was different somehow. She could sense it. The way he would watch her, the way his low voice sounded in these caverns, and the threatening and powerful appearance he carried. Everything about him frightened her, and yet she was enthralled by it. Her heart raced as she sat down on the corner of his bed, the soft material sinking beneath her weight and lulling her closer. He watched as she admired his luxurious bed. Dovain reached behind him for one of his pillows, resting it beside her as a silent invitation. She leaned against it with a slight smile, and his eyes studied hers with a groggy haze. One of his hands lifted from the fold of the sheets and grazed across her face with the back of his fingers. His hand felt cold against her warm skin. His fingers traced her cheekbone up to her ear and brushed gently along her golden hair, which streamed across the pillow. Her eyelashes battered slowly as his fingers drifted back down to her cheekbone and skimmed across her lips, her breath ghosting across his hand. Then down to her chin and her slender neck, his hand drifted along her warm flesh. Here his hand lingered, and he moved closer to her, his other hand lifting to follow the same path that the other had followed. And as it did, his dark eyes gazed deeply into hers as he said, "You were very brave coming into my chamber to warn me." He paused for a moment, drawing a circle with his finger around where the seal of darkness was burned on her cheek. "Very brave," he repeated. "Are you pleased with me, master?" Justine asked, smiling as he traced the burn of his emblem on her cheek. His hand rested over the burn for a moment, and he watched as the ring slowly faded away, the power of the immortal seal releasing her from his bond. In a moment, the burn was gone. His hazy eyes delved deeply into hers as his curving lips drew back in a smile. The sharp edges of his teeth appeared as he lowered his head to whisper in her ear, "I am not pleased." And all at once, both of his hands were around her neck, and her cry caught in her throat as his fingers tightened. "You lied to me. You said that the princess was conspiring against me, but I know that wasn't true. She would not betray me. I do not like that, Justine. I do not like to be lied to." Justine choked, trying to apologize as her vision started fading. Dovain's grip tightened more and more around her throat. He ignored her struggled pleas, leaning over her and putting his weight down on his arms as her eyes began to roll back. In his exertion, Dovain was trembling and his breaths were jagged, but he did not release her until he felt the pulse in her neck finally stop. When at last it was finished, he let out a deep breath and fell back onto his bed, the soft cushion enveloping his tense shoulders. He stared up at the ceiling of his chamber for several moments, trying to steady his breaths. Exhausted, he drifted off to sleep, with the strangled girl still lying across his bed, but confident that his bride-to-be was sleeping soundly. He knew that Rachel would never dare to conspire against him, not with her kingdom on the brink of destruction. He knew that Rachel had no other choice but to give him her unconditional loyalty.